The weight of the rope. The rope had been salvaged from a destroyed Japanese communication line 3 days earlier, its hemp fibers stained dark with rain and something else that Desmond Doss preferred not to think about. Now it lay coiled beside the twisted remains of an artillery piece at the edge of Hacksaw Ridge, waiting to bear witness to either salvation or catastrophe. The morning mist clung to the coral limestone cliffs of Okinawa, like smoke from the previous night's bombardment, and somewhere in that grey void below, stretcher-bearers waited with empty hands. Private First Class Doss knelt beside the rope, testing each section for frays, while artillery shells whistled overhead toward Japanese positions deeper inland. His medical bag hung heavy on his shoulder, not from supplies, which had run dangerously low, but from the weight of knowing how many wounded men still lay scattered across the blood-soaked plateau behind him. The order had come down 20 minutes ago. Withdraw to defensive positions below the ridge, regroup, wait for reinforcements, leave the wounded. "Doss, you heard the lieutenant," Sergeant Hayes called through the smoke. "We're moving out, now." Doss continued examining the rope, running his fingers along a section where the strands had begun to separate. Behind him, the cries for help echoed across the shattered landscape, voices that had called him coward just hours earlier when the company advanced without him carrying a rifle. Now those same voices pleaded through gritted teeth for the medic who refused to abandon them. "I can't leave them, Sergeant," Doss said quietly, not looking up from the rope. "They're still calling for help." Hayes crouched beside him, rain dripping from the rim of his helmet. The sergeant's face showed the exhaustion of 3 weeks fighting across Okinawa's treacherous terrain, where every ridge concealed machine gun nests and every advance cost more than it gained. His voice carried the weight of too many retreats, too many men left behind. "You go up there alone. You're dead," Hayes said. "And dead medics don't save anybody." Doss finally looked up, his young face streaked with mud and coral dust. The contradiction that had followed him since basic training hung in the air between them. How could a man who wouldn't carry a weapon venture into the most dangerous ground on the entire Okinawa front? How could someone so committed to preserving life keep walking toward places where death waited behind every shattered tree stump? "I'll be careful, Sergeant, but I can't leave knowing they're up there." The sound of boots on wet stone announced the withdrawal of the rest of the company. Men moved past them in the mist, their faces blank with the particular exhaustion that comes from climbing the same deadly ridge 3 times in 4 days. Some glanced at Doss with expressions caught between admiration and something approaching fear, not of the Japanese positions ahead, but of the moral weight his presence placed on their own shoulders. Private Morrison limped past, supported by another soldier. His leg bore the awkward bulge of a field dressing wrapped hastily around a shrapnel wound. 3 days earlier, this same man had openly questioned whether medics who refused to carry weapons belonged in combat units. Now he paused beside Doss, his eyes reflecting a complexity that simple pain couldn't explain. "You don't have to prove anything to us anymore," Morrison said quietly. "We know what you're made of." But Doss had already turned back to the rope, calculating distances and weights with the methodical precision of a man who had lowered 17 wounded soldiers to safety since dawn. The cliff face dropped 40 feet to a narrow ledge where corpsmen waited to receive casualties. Each descent required perfect timing. Too fast, and the wounded man would slam into the rocky face. Too slow, and Japanese snipers would find their target. The voices calling from the plateau grew fainter as shock and blood loss took their toll. Doss closed his eyes and listened to each one, trying to gauge direction and urgency. His hands trembled slightly as he secured the rope around the artillery piece, not from fear, though fear lived in his chest like a constant pressure, but from the weight of choosing to stay when every tactical manual, every order, every survival instinct demanded retreat. Hayes stood slowly, water streaming from his poncho. "How many more you figure are up there?" Doss opened his eyes and looked toward the mist-shrouded plateau where muzzle flashes had sparkled like deadly stars just hours before. "I don't know, Sergeant, but I hear at least 6 voices, maybe more. And you're going after them, alone, with no weapon." "With this rope, and whatever supplies I can carry." The sergeant shook his head, but something in his expression had shifted. Hayes had watched Doss work under fire for 3 weeks, had seen him crawl through crossfire to reach wounded men while bullets kicked up coral chips around his head. The young medic's stubborn faith had become both inspiration and burden to the company, a reminder of standards that felt impossible to meet. "I can't order you to do this," Hayes said finally, "but I can't order you not to either." As the sergeant disappeared into the mist with the last of the withdrawing force, Doss found himself alone at the edge of Hacksaw Ridge with a fraying rope and the voices of men who had nowhere else to place their hope. The rain continued to fall, turning the coral dust to sticky mud and filling shell craters with murky water that reflected the grey Okinawan sky. Somewhere in the caves below the ridge, Japanese soldiers repositioned their machine guns and waited for any movement on the plateau above. Doss wrapped one end of the rope around his waist and began to climb back up toward the killing ground, following the cries for help that echoed through the smoke and mist. Behind him, the rope uncoiled slowly, measuring out the distance between safety and the place where courage becomes something harder to name. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The plateau stretched before Doss like a moonscape carved by weeks of artillery bombardment, each shell crater a potential grave or salvation depending on what lay hidden in its depths. The morning attack had transformed the top of Hacksaw Ridge into a maze of shattered coral, splintered timber, and the scattered equipment of 2 armies locked in a struggle that neither seemed able to win decisively. Japanese machine gun positions, invisible from below, commanded clear fields of fire across the open ground where American forces had tried to advance at dawn. Doss moved carefully from crater to crater, his medical bag bouncing against his hip with each careful step. The rope behind him traced a thin lifeline back to the cliff edge, but up here on the plateau, 40 feet might as well have been 40 miles. The voices he had heard from below resolved into specific locations now: a corporal trapped beneath a fallen communications antenna, a rifleman dragging himself slowly toward what he hoped was American-held ground, and others whose cries came from places that seemed impossibly exposed to enemy fire. The first man he reached was Private Collins, a 19-year-old from Ohio, whose left arm hung at an angle that spoke of shattered bone. Collins lay in a shallow depression behind what remained of a Japanese bunker, his face pale with shock and blood loss. When he saw Doss approaching, his eyes widened with something between relief and disbelief. "Thought everyone had pulled back," Collins whispered through clenched teeth. "They did," Doss replied, opening his medical bag and examining the arm. "But you're not everyone." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. 3 weeks earlier, during their first night on Okinawa, Collins had been among the loudest voices questioning Doss's place in a rifle company. How could a man contribute to unit effectiveness if he refused to carry the basic tool of infantry warfare? How could his squadmates trust someone whose convictions prevented him from providing covering fire? Now, as Doss cut away the torn fabric around Collins's fracture and began fashioning a proper splint from rifle stock and medical tape, those questions seemed to belong to a different war entirely. The gentle precision of the medic's hands, the way he positioned his own body to shield Collins from potential sniper fire, the quiet confidence with which he worked, all of it spoke to a kind of courage that hadn't been covered in any training manual. "This is going to hurt," Doss warned as he began stabilizing the arm, "but I need to get it set before we move you." Collins nodded, biting down on a piece of leather from his helmet strap. Through the pain, he watched Doss work with the focused intensity of a man whose faith had been tested by weeks of carrying wounded soldiers through places where faith seemed like the least practical resource imaginable. Yet here he was, 40 feet above safety, working by feel in the grey morning light while Japanese positions remained active all around them. The splinting took 15 minutes that felt like hours. Every sound, the distant pop of sniper fire, the scrape of equipment being moved in unseen positions, the wet flutter of torn canvas in the wind, carried the possibility of discovery. When Doss finally secured Collins in an improvised harness and began lowering him toward the cliff edge, the rope groaned under the weight and sang against the coral limestone with a sound like a prayer stretched thin. Halfway down, Collins called up softly, "Doss, why didn't you leave with the others?" The question hung in the air above the cliff face while Doss paid out rope hand over hand, his palms already raw from the morning's earlier evacuations. Below, he could see the stretcher-bearers moving toward the base of the cliff, their olive-drab uniforms barely visible against the jungle undergrowth that clung to the lower slopes of the ridge. The sight reminded him that each man he lowered represented not just a life saved, but a family somewhere in America that wouldn't receive a telegram beginning with, "The War Department regrets to inform you." "Because you were still calling for help," Doss finally answered. "And I heard you." When Collins reached safety and the rope came back up empty, Doss coiled it carefully and prepared to move toward the next voice. The morning mist was beginning to lift, which would make movement more dangerous, but visibility better. He could see now that at least 4 more wounded men lay scattered across the plateau, some in positions that would require him to cross open ground, swept by machine gun fire from caves along the eastern slope. The tactical situation made no sense from any conventional standpoint. A lone medic, armed only with medical supplies and stubborn faith, moving deliberately through ground that a full rifle company had been forced to abandon. Every principle of fire and movement, every lesson about surviving under enemy observation, every instinct developed through weeks of combat, suggested that what he was doing was not just dangerous, but futile. Yet the voices continued to call, and the rope remained strong enough to bear the weight of 1 more wounded soldier. As Doss began crawling toward a shell crater where someone was calling for morphine, he thought about the letters he had written home to his wife Dorothy, letters that tried to explain what it felt like to serve as a combat medic without carrying a weapon. How could he describe the particular weight of walking into gunfire armed only with bandages and the conviction that every life was worth preserving? The rain intensified, turning the coral dust to slippery mud and filling the air with the smell of wet earth and cordite. Somewhere in the caves below the ridge, Japanese soldiers adjusted their weapons and waited for any sign of American movement. But up on the plateau, one unarmed medic continued his methodical progress from crater to crater, following the cries for help that echoed through the smoke and mist, like prayers that refused to be ignored. The weight of repetition settled on Doss like the persistent Okinawan rain, the same careful approach to each crater, the same gentle examination of wounds, the same improvised harness fashioned from medical tape and stretcher straps, the same burning sensation as hemp fibers passed through his torn palms. By noon, he had lowered 8 more wounded soldiers down the cliff face, and the rope showed dangerous signs of wear where it rubbed against the sharp coral limestone at the edge. In the aid station below the ridge, Captain Williams pressed his back against the canvas wall of the medical tent and watched stretcher-bearers arrive with another casualty lowered from above. The doctor's hands, steady through 3 weeks of treating everything from shrapnel wounds to trench foot, trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette and tried to make sense of the impossible arithmetic playing out on Hacksaw Ridge. "How many more can that rope take?" asked Sergeant Muller, one of the corpsmen who had been receiving the lowered casualties. His uniform was soaked with rain and blood, and his face showed the particular exhaustion that comes from catching wounded men at the end of a 40-foot descent through enemy-controlled airspace. Williams took a long drag from his cigarette and shook his head. "Not many," Hemp rope has a breaking point just like everything else. And Doss has been using that same line since dawn. Through the tent opening, they could see the base of the cliff, where more stretcher-bearers waited in whatever cover they could find. Rain dripped from the jungle canopy above, creating small streams that carried the red coral dust of Okinawa toward the sea. The sound of machine gun fire from the plateau above had become sporadic. Either the Japanese were conserving ammunition, or they couldn't get clear shots at a single medic who moved with the patient deliberation of a man following his conscience rather than tactical doctrine. "Sir," Muller said quietly, "what happens if the rope breaks?" The question hung between them like smoke from William's cigarette. Both men had seen the casualties Doss had been lowering, soldiers who would have died from blood loss or shock if left on the plateau until nightfall, when a proper evacuation might have been possible. Each successful descent represented not just a life saved, but proof that sometimes the most impractical forms of courage produce the most practical results. Back on the ridge, Doss knelt beside Corporal Henderson, whose leg showed the telltale signs of a compound fracture complicated by shrapnel wounds. Henderson was conscious, but drifting in and out of shock, his face gray with blood loss. Unlike the others, he seemed genuinely puzzled by Doss's presence rather than relieved. "They said you all pulled back," Henderson mumbled. "Said the ridge was too hot to hold." "The ridge is too hot to hold," Doss replied, cutting away torn fabric to examine the wounds. "But you're still here, so I'm still here." As he worked to stabilize Henderson's leg and control the bleeding, Doss found himself thinking about the letters that would be written if he failed to get these men down safely. Not just the official casualty reports, with their precise language about grid coordinates and time of death, but the personal letters that families would receive from squad mates and friends. How would they explain that good men had died because the rope broke, or because one stubborn medic had finally pushed his luck too far? The morphine injection took effect slowly, and Henderson's breathing became more regular. While Doss prepared another improvised harness, the corporal's eyes focused with surprising clarity. "My daddy was a preacher," Henderson said suddenly. "Used to say that faith without works is dead. But I never figured works without weapons." Doss paused in his harness preparation and met Henderson's eyes. The rain had stopped temporarily, leaving the plateau wrapped in an unnatural silence broken only by the distant sound of artillery fire from other sectors. In that moment, both men understood something that couldn't be captured in after-action reports or medal citations, that courage sometimes required not just the willingness to face death, but the willingness to face it in ways that made no tactical sense whatsoever. "Your daddy sounds like a wise man," Doss said as he secured the harness around Henderson's chest. The descent took longer than the others because of Henderson's weight and the need to prevent further damage to his fractured leg. Doss watched the rope carefully as it passed through his hands, noting each place where individual strands had begun to separate under constant stress. By his count, he had lowered 23 wounded soldiers since dawn, and each successful evacuation brought the rope closer to its breaking point. When Henderson reached safety and the empty harness came back up, Doss coiled the rope and looked across the plateau toward the remaining voices. The afternoon light revealed Japanese positions more clearly now, cave mouths and reinforced bunkers that commanded overlapping fields of fire across the open ground. Any rational assessment would conclude that he had already pushed his luck beyond any reasonable limit, but reason had little to do with what kept him moving from crater to crater as the afternoon wore on. The voices calling for help carried the weight of specific faces, specific names, specific families who trusted that someone would answer when their sons and husbands called for a medic. The rope might break, the Japanese might finally get a clear shot, or exhaustion might finally claim what enemy fire had not, but as long as wounded men called his name across that shattered plateau, Doss found it impossible to turn toward the cliff edge and descend to safety. The sound of rain began again, turning the coral dust to mud and filling shell craters with water that reflected the grey Okinawan sky. In the caves below the ridge, Japanese soldiers cleaned their weapons and waited for any sign of movement. But one American medic continued his patient work, following a rope that measured the distance between tactical wisdom and the conviction that no one should die alone on a ridge whose name would become legend. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The rope snapped at 1847 hours, just as Doss was lowering Private Martinez toward the jungle floor below Hacksaw Ridge. The hemp fibers, weakened by rain and stretched beyond their limits by 28 previous descents, parted with a sound like a gunshot that echoed off the coral limestone walls. For 3 seconds that lasted forever, Martinez fell through empty air toward the rocks below, his terrified shout dissolving into the sound of rain and distant artillery. Then the secondary line caught him. Doss had rigged the backup rope 20 minutes earlier, threading it through a different anchor point after noticing how the primary line had begun to fray where it rubbed against the cliff edge. The precaution saved Martinez's life, but it left Doss stranded 40 feet above safety with no way down, and at least 6 more wounded men scattered across the plateau behind him. Below in the aid station, Captain Williams heard the snap and knew immediately what it meant. He crushed his cigarette under his boot and began preparing for the worst. Either Doss would find another way down, or the evacuation operation would end with one more casualty to add to the day's grim tally. The mathematics of war suggested that risking one medic to save 28 wounded soldiers represented sound tactical thinking. But Williams had been practicing medicine long enough to know that mathematics rarely captured the full cost of such calculations. "Sir," Sergeant Muller called from outside the tent, "the rope broke, but the soldier made it down. Private Martinez, compound fracture of the right femur, possible internal bleeding." Williams nodded and moved toward the treatment area, but his thoughts remained with the young medic stranded on the ridge above. Through 3 weeks of fighting across Okinawa's treacherous terrain, he had watched Doss develop a reputation that transcended normal military categories. Other medics were brave, skilled, dedicated, but none of them moved through enemy fire with quite the same deliberate confidence, as if faith itself provided a kind of tactical protection that couldn't be taught in field manuals. On the plateau, Doss knelt beside the broken rope and calculated his remaining options. The backup line was too short to reach the bottom of the cliff, and fashioning another rope from available materials would take time he didn't have. Japanese positions had been quiet for the past hour, but that silence felt more ominous than reassuring, like the moment before a storm breaks in full fury. The voices calling for help seemed fainter now, weakened by blood loss and the approach of evening. Each cry reminded him of the central contradiction that had defined his service as a combat medic: how to preserve life in places specifically designed for its destruction, how to maintain hope when every tactical assessment suggested hopelessness. Private Kowalski lay in a shell crater 30 yards from the cliff edge, his chest rising and falling with the irregular rhythm of internal bleeding. When Doss reached him, crawling carefully to avoid silhouetting himself against the sky, Kowalski's eyes reflected the glazed look of advancing shock. "Thought I heard the rope break," Kowalski whispered. "It did, but that doesn't change anything for you." Doss began examining Kowalski's injuries with the methodical precision of a man who had learned to work by touch in situations where visual examination might draw sniper fire. The wounds were serious. Shrapnel had penetrated the chest cavity, and internal bleeding was evident from the pale color of Kowalski's skin and the weakness of his pulse. Without immediate evacuation to a surgical unit, the soldier would die within hours. But the rope was broken, and alternative descent routes down the 40-foot cliff face looked impossible for a wounded man. As Doss worked to stabilize Kowalski's breathing and control external bleeding, he found himself facing the same moral equation that had defined every choice since dawn. Was it better to stay with the wounded and die together, or to find some way down and live with the knowledge that he had abandoned them? The answer came not from tactical training or religious instruction, but from the simple fact that Kowalski was still breathing, still looking at him with eyes that held a trust no military regulation could adequately address. Doss had carried no weapon since entering combat, but he had carried something else, a conviction that every life possessed a value that transcended military necessity or tactical convenience. "Listen to me," he told Kowalski. "I'm going to get you down from here. It might not be the way we planned, but you're going home." Using materials salvaged from damaged equipment scattered across the plateau, Doss began constructing an improvised stretcher from rifle stocks, torn canvas, and paracord stripped from destroyed communications gear. The work required him to move more extensively across open ground, but the alternative, leaving Kowalski to die alone in a shell crater, violated every principle that had brought him to this ridge in the first place. As he worked, other voices continued to call from the gathering darkness. Each cry represented another impossible choice, another test of the conviction that had sustained him through weeks of combat without a weapon. The rain intensified, turning the coral dust to slippery mud that made movement treacherous and rope work potentially fatal. But failure was not measured by tactical success or survival percentages. It was measured by the willingness to keep answering when wounded soldiers called for help, even when answering meant walking into situations that every rational assessment declared hopeless. As Doss secured Kowalski to the improvised stretcher and began planning a descent route that had never been attempted on Hacksaw Ridge, he understood that some battles were won not by superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but by the simple refusal to abandon the wounded when abandonment would be the reasonable choice. The rope might be broken, but the covenant between medic and soldier remained intact. In the growing darkness above one of Okinawa's most contested ridges, an unarmed medic prepared to attempt the impossible, guided by faith and the voices of men who had nowhere else to place their trust. What the citation never mentioned was the moment when Doss nearly broke. It came at 19:30 hours as he struggled to lower Kowalski's improvised stretcher down a section of cliff face that offered no good handholds and no margin for error. The paracord stretched thin under the weight, and loose coral crumbled away beneath his feet with each careful step. Below them, 40 feet of empty air waited to claim any mistake. Above them, Japanese voices echoed from cave positions that had remained mysteriously quiet for the past hour. Halfway down, with Kowalski's life hanging literally in the balance, Doss felt his faith waver for the first time since climbing back up the ridge that morning. His hands shook not just from exhaustion and rope burn, but from the accumulated weight of 29 descents, each one a test of conviction that demanded more than he was certain he possessed. The young man who had entered combat refusing to carry a weapon now faced the possibility that his principles had led him into a situation where both he and Kowalski would die for the sake of moral consistency. "Doss," Kowalski whispered from the stretcher, his voice barely audible above the wind. "If something happens, tell my mother I wasn't scared." The lie was unnecessary. Both men knew that fear had become their constant companion, as present as the mud and rain and coral dust that covered everything on Okinawa. But the kindness in Kowalski's voice, the way he was trying to protect Doss from guilt, even while suspended above certain death, pierced through the young medic's moment of doubt, like light through smoke. "You're going to tell her yourself," Doss replied, testing each step before committing his full weight to the descent. The truth that would never appear in any official record was simpler and more complex than heroism. Doss continued, not because he felt particularly brave in that moment, but because stopping would mean watching Kowalski die, and that seemed harder to bear than the possibility of falling. Faith, he discovered, was not the absence of doubt, but the choice to act in spite of it, to keep moving when movement itself became a form of prayer. They reached the jungle floor at 2003 hours, long after conventional wisdom suggested that any movement on or around Hacksaw Ridge had become suicidal. Stretcher bearers materialized from the undergrowth to receive Kowalski, their faces reflecting the disbelief of men witnessing something that transcended normal military categories. In the aid station below, Captain Williams checked his watch and made a notation that would later become part of the official record. Last casualty evacuated from Hacksaw Ridge, 2003 hours, 15 May 1945. What the notation couldn't capture was the cost of those extra hours on the ridge. As medics worked to stabilize Kowalski's condition, Doss sat on an ammunition crate outside the aid station and discovered that his hands wouldn't stop trembling. Not from cold or exhaustion, though both were present, but from the accumulated stress of choices that had pushed him far beyond anything resembling normal human limits. Sergeant Hayes found him there 20 minutes later, still staring at hands that seemed to belong to someone else. "How many?" Hayes asked quietly. 31, Doss replied without looking up. 31 men down that cliff. Hayes sat beside him on another ammunition crate, close enough to offer human warmth, but far enough away to respect the space that trauma requires. Both men understood that some experiences couldn't be processed through normal conversation or military debriefing procedures. What Doss had done on Hacksaw Ridge existed in a category that had no adequate vocabulary, no precedent in field manuals or training scenarios. "You know they're going to write this up," Hayes said. "Probably recommend you for something significant." Doss nodded, still studying his hands. The prospect of citations and medals felt abstract compared to the immediate reality of rope burn and the voices that still echoed in his memory. Each wounded soldier had possessed a name, a face, a specific pattern of injuries that required improvised solutions. Reducing that experience to official language seemed both necessary and inadequate, like translating poetry into mathematics. "What will you tell them?" Hayes asked. "When they ask how you did it?" The question touched the heart of something that would follow Doss for the rest of his life. The gap between public recognition and private memory, between the story that people wanted to hear and the truth that lived in his body and dreams. What he had done on Hacksaw Ridge would become legend, but legends were simpler than the actual experience of fear, doubt, and the moment-by-moment choice to continue when continuation seemed impossible. "I'll tell them about the rope," Doss said finally. "How it held when it shouldn't have, how it broke exactly when we had a backup ready. I'll tell them about the men, their names, where they were from, what they said while I was working on them. I'll tell them that it felt less like heroism and more like the only choice that made sense at the time." But even as he spoke, Doss knew that official accounts would focus on results rather than process, on courage rather than fear, on success rather than the numerous moments when failure seemed inevitable. The story would become cleaner, more inspiring, more useful for building morale and demonstrating American values. What it might lose in that translation was the truth that real courage emerged not from the absence of terror, but from the decision to act despite being terrified. As rain continued to fall on the jungle canopy above them, two soldiers sat in silence outside a medical tent, processing an experience that would define both of their lives in ways they couldn't yet understand. Somewhere above them, Hacksaw Ridge settled into an uneasy quiet, its coral cliffs bearing witness to the truth that some battles are won not by superior tactics or overwhelming force, but by the simple refusal to abandon those who depend on your presence in their darkest moments. The nightmares began 3 weeks later, during the ship ride back to the States. Doss would wake to the sound of hemp rope singing against coral limestone, his hands instinctively reaching for the frayed line that existed now only in memory and dreams. The medal ceremony in Washington felt like watching someone else's life, a young medic in dress uniform accepting recognition for actions that had already begun to feel like they belonged to a different person entirely. 43 years later, sitting in his kitchen in Alabama, while rain drummed against the roof, Doss could still feel the weight of that rope in his palms. His hands, marked now by age and the accumulated wear of a lifetime working with them, retained a kind of muscle memory that transcended conscious recollection. Sometimes, hearing rain on metal roofing, he would close his eyes and find himself back on Hacksaw Ridge, listening to voices calling through smoke and mist. The official citation spoke of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, language that captured the essential facts while missing the essential truth. What it couldn't convey was the weight of each individual choice, the decision to test the rope one more time, to cross open ground under observation, to keep answering when wounded soldiers called for help, even when answering seemed tactically insane. His wife, Dorothy, moving quietly around the kitchen as she prepared dinner, understood the geography of his silences. After 4 decades of marriage, she had learned to recognize the moments when some sound or smell or quality of light transported him back to that ridge above the Okinawan jungle. She never interrupted these journeys into memory, but she stayed close, a gentle presence that served as an anchor to the present. The Matthews boys stopped by earlier, she mentioned, referring to their neighbor's grandson who was studying World War II for a school project. Wants to interview you for his paper. Doss nodded, still listening to the rain. Interviews had become more frequent as historians and journalists discovered that many first-hand accounts of the Pacific Theater were disappearing with the generation that had lived them. Each conversation required him to navigate the distance between public narrative and private memory, to translate experiences that remained vivid in his body into words that could convey their significance to people who had never heard the particular sound that rope makes when it's stretched to its breaking point. "What will you tell him?" Dorothy asked gently. "Same thing I always tell them, that it was never about being a hero. It was about hearing men call for help and knowing I had the training to answer." But the fuller truth was more complex, and Doss knew it would remain largely unspoken. How could he explain the moment when faith became not just belief, but action, when conviction transformed from abstract principle into the willingness to walk into places where survival seemed unlikely? How could he convey the weight of choosing to stay when everyone else, sensibly, rationally, chose to leave? The rope had become, over the years, his most reliable metaphor for what had happened on Hacksaw Ridge. Not the hemp rope itself, which had broken and been discarded like countless other pieces of military equipment, but what it represented, the thin line between safety and danger, between abandoning the wounded and refusing to abandon them, between the reasonable choice and the choice that transcended reason, without abandoning responsibility. In letters to families of men he had evacuated from the ridge, Doss had tried to capture something of what their sons and husbands had endured with quiet dignity while waiting for rescue. These were not letters that spoke of glory or grand historical moments, but of small human details, the way Private Morrison had apologized for bleeding on Doss's medical bag, how Corporal Henderson had asked him to pray with him during the descent, the gentle humor that men maintained, even when suspended 40 feet above ground on a rope that everyone knew might break at any moment. The rain intensified, and Doss found himself remembering not the moments of highest drama, but the quiet intervals between evacuations when he knelt alone on the plateau, testing rope strength and listening for voices calling through the smoke. Those moments had contained their own weight, the accumulation of individual choices that, taken together, had somehow added up to something that people called heroic, but that had felt in the living of it more like the only way forward that his conscience would allow. Dorothy set a cup of coffee beside him, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder before returning to her work. The gesture anchored him to the kitchen in Alabama, to the life he had built after the war, to the truth that courage was not a single dramatic action, but a pattern of choices extended over time. The young man who had climbed Hacksaw Ridge with nothing but medical supplies and stubborn faith had become an old man who still woke sometimes to the sound of rope against stone, still carried in his body the weight of every soldier he had lowered to safety. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the sound, if he listened carefully, he could hear the echoes of voices that had trusted him to answer when they called for help in their darkest hour. The legend would outlive him, but the memory belonged to him alone. 31 faces, 31 names, 31 descents down a cliff face that had tested not just physical courage, but the deeper conviction that every life possessed a value worth defending, even at the cost of his own. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.